50 years ago to the day, riot police entered Paris's Sorbonne University to bring a student sit-in to an end. Soon, barricades were going up and violent clashes were breaking out in the Latin Quarter. But rebellion in May 1968 wasn't just a French phenomenon. It extended from the classrooms of the LSE in London to the streets of Prague. Young people made a stance against the old, workers made a stance against their employers, and protesters made a stance against the elite, with a spattering of cultural revolution thrown in, including a little rock music. Well, in today's Perspective segment, we're joined by Richard Vinen, an historian at King's College London. His new work on that global revolt, titled The Long 68 Radical Protest and Its Enemies, has just been published. He joins us now live from London. Mr. Vinen, thank you for being with us. In your book, you mentioned this anecdote about the activists taking part in 68, not actually bothering to fill in their tax reforms that year. They were so confident that this revolt would lead to the fall of the government, that the bourgeoisie would go. But in your view, did this revolution actually pan out as the people taking part had hoped for?
Good morning. No, it certainly didn't pan out, because they did have to pay their taxes in the end. And because in France, at least, and in quite a lot of countries, the short-term result of 68 is actually a kind of reaction. So in the short term, much to everyone's surprise, de Gaulle regains control of France at the end of May, and then there's a big Gaullist victory in the legislative elections of June 1968. So you actually end up, in the short term, with the political right being strengthened.
When I was reading your book, I had this overwhelming thought that there were so many contradictions involved in 68. It was meant to be left-wing, but it of course led to right-wing victories at the polls. The watchword at the time was youth and youngsters, but it was a revolt that also kind of crossed and transcended generations. It was as much about student debate in debate chambers, about anti-war rhetoric, but it was also very much about bread and butter worker issues. The whole issue of 68 is a total minefield, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And one has this curious kind of sense that sometimes people were living different 68s at the same time. So occasionally I've been interviewed with people who were in Paris in 1968 and rather disconcertingly describe things that I don't recognise at all. But obviously they were there. My sense is that one of the things, of course, is that in Paris, especially 68, it's very much a street-by-street thing, very much a huge centre of drama in the Latin Quarter, and people just a few hundred metres away from each other could sometimes be having rather different kinds of experiences.
Now, you make the distinction between 68 the year and 68 the event, one that you describe as being the long 68. Just how long did it go on for, and when, if at all, can we place the full stop?
Well, I think it probably starts in the early 60s, especially in the United States, with Students for a Democratic Society, the kind of end of the McCarthyite period, takes a big kind of swerve to the left around the time of American stepping up the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s, which I think really marks the beginning of a break between the radical left and the kind of moderate left that was often in government. When it ends, well, as I say, there's a kind of short-term end, which often means victory for the political right, but then there are all sorts of long-term legacies that go on into the 1970s. So in lots of ways, things like women's liberation, gay liberation, which are things that may not necessarily be hugely important in 68 itself, but which partly come out of 68, then become very important. And of course, also, a lot of the 68ers, because they're so young in 1968 itself, have this huge, long career ahead of them, so that in some ways, these people hold most power in the era of Bill Clinton, Joschka Fischer. Tony Blair's government contains a lot of former 68ers. So that's like the late 1990s is probably the moment when those kind of people come into government. And Daniel Cohn-Bendit, of course, the French student leader of 1968, still very much around and in lots of ways quite a prominent supporter of Emmanuel Macron.
Now, in the title of your book, you talk about the enemies of 68. How influential were they in bringing this whole revolt to an end, or did it just die out naturally?
Well, I think in some ways they do bring it to an end. So I think people who deal with 68 are often more subtle than we give them credit for. So we talk about kind of the riot police and repression, but often there's a kind of quite skillful process of compromise with 68 by people in government. So Georges Pompidou in France is a much more flexible figure than de Gaulle, and is very careful about what degree of confrontation he's willing to impose on the students. He eventually takes the riot police out of the Sorbonne and just lets the student reoccupy it and kind of lets the student movement burn itself out a bit. In Britain, James Callaghan, the Home Secretary, Labour Home Secretary, but normally seen as a rather conservative with a small C person, lets Daniel Cohn-Bendit come into the country in 1968. And when he's asked by right-wingers, why did you let him do this? He produces this rather amusing response where he says, I need to teach him the words of the Internationale, which he seems not to know. So I think in that sense, there's quite a clever, rather than just repressive response from the enemies of 68 sometimes.
Now, do you think it's wise or even accurate to make parallels between what's happening in France now and what happened in France 50 years ago? Of course, this spring we've seen a wave of student and worker protests and strikes taking place against the Macron government, most recently, of course, on May Day. Could 2018, in your view, be a repeat or the new 68?
Well, that's an interesting question because, of course, in some ways, the defining feature of 68, especially in France, was its unexpectedness. No one thought 68 was going to happen in the way that it did. So I may make myself look very stupid if I say the kind of things that people would have said at the beginning of May or the beginning of 1968 in France, if I then say, well, actually not very much is going to happen. But my sense is events so far in France are still very restricted compared to what happened in 1968. People talk about 1,200 people involved in violence the day before yesterday. Well, that compares with 3,000 people just occupying the Odeon Theatre in 1968. And I think, in fact, the most interesting commentary on this has come from Cohn-Bendit himself, the student leader in 1968. And when he's asked about the legacy, he says two things, one of which is it's a long time ago, and in 1968, no one asked us about 1918. And the second, which I think is a very kind of defining characteristic of the difference between the two, is he says, in 1968, we weren't afraid of the future. Whereas I think now, both workers and students, often their characteristic is this sense of nervousness about what's going to happen rather than kind of utopian optimism about what might happen.
Richard Vinen from King's College London, thank you very much for being with us. Just to remind our viewers, this is your new book, The Long 68, Radical Protest and Its Enemies, which has just been published. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're watching live from Paris. These are the latest headlines. Nicole Pashinyan's Velvet Revolution edges closer to a smooth ending. He's told his supporters to suspend their street protests and go home, after all parties announced they'll now support him in his bid to become Armenia's next Prime Minister. Cambridge Analytica shuts up shop. The political consultancy firm at the centre of the recent Facebook scandal blames the barrage of media interest for driving its customers away. The company was accused of wrongly using data harvested from the social media giant for its political clients.